Hey, it's Austin with Lost Art Reimagined. 7 months ago, I made my first epoxy river table, and I've learned so much since then. In this video, I will be reacting to that build, cringing at my own inexperience, as well as sharing some tips with new woodworkers that have taken me a year to learn. So instead of making a tutorial video, I'll show you what I did, what went wrong, and how I've improved in the 7 months since recording this video. There are people out there who make beautiful river tables, both on and off YouTube, but I wanted to do something a little differently than them. So here's my take on the epoxy river table. Like any good table build, I started by making sawdust on the lathe. Then I cut up some Fadook and some purple hearts to be thrown into the river. So here I'm taping up cracks. And that makes sense because I don't want to epoxy my coffee table to the workbench. But if I was going to tape the whole thing anyways, why didn't I just do that in the first place? I added the extra tape so I could hot glue a board, so that the coffee table would keep its shape when I filled the river with sawdust. I tried a lot of different ways to fill cracks in the past, but multicolored, multi-species wood shavings and wood chips, as well as epoxy, had worked out very pretty for me in the past, and I wanted to scale it up to an entire table. Out of the entire build, this part was the most confusing to look back on. I own power tools. Why am I using a rusty saw and a chisel? At least this way I'm more in touch with my ancestors. This is how Aristotle and Pythagoras made epoxy river tables in medieval Scotland. Humanity has been using these tools for thousands of years since aliens built the pyramids. The reason I hadn't actually used power tools until now is because, for one thing, all of the epoxied wood chips sticking up could damage the planer if they hit in the wrong direction. And for another, it was too uneven to go through the finish sander because it wasn't flat on either side anymore. I did have an angle grinder at the time that I made that, but I didn't used to keep it at the shop, so that was not an option. Hand tools were really, unfortunately, the only thing that I could choose from. It looks like I held down the table with one hand while I sawed with the other, or I just let the table slide down my workbench. Both options are pretty bad. The actual way to do it is to clamp your project to the table, or to put a clamp at the end of the table and slide your project into it. Either way, your project can't move while you're working on it. Oh hey, I finally found a power tool. See that hand in the corner of the video? That's the guy who knows how clamps work and told me to use them. I started prepping to do a surface coat of epoxy when I realized there were still holes on the edges that needed to be filled with CA glue. I filled the holes and I sanded until the edge was ready to be epoxied. I poured the first coat of epoxy and chased the air bubbles away with a heat gun. There's a couple things to be careful about with heat guns. If you blow too hard in one place, your epoxy can start to smoke, and the heat gun itself can overheat the project, causing more bubbles to appear. Each epoxy pour took about an hour and cost about $20. I had scuffed the surface, but I didn't want to pour again if I didn't have to. Turns out I had to. I tried hot gluing boards to the bottom of the project to keep the table from bowing when I added epoxy, but it still bowed because only the top of the table absorbs epoxy, the bottom's dry, so the pores on top will absorb that epoxy and expand. The pores underneath the board don't absorb any epoxy. Uneven expansion causes the board to bow. Finishing both sides of the project the same way is the easiest way I know of to avoid these problems. It's also possible to use metal C-channels to hold the table straight, but I didn't do that with this project. Luckily, my tabletop was thin enough that I could clamp the table until it was straight, then I made a jig to hold it in place while I epoxied the other side. I'm not sure if it would have straightened itself out if I hadn't used the jig. I might test that out sometime. I don't know. I like to keep my projects from bowing in the first place at this point. I had to do a second layer of epoxy on the bottom because I hadn't covered the spots where my straightening jig sat. Since it was the bottom, I could have probably got away with putting epoxy just on the edges to cover the empty spots. Not very many people are going to go underneath the table to see what the bottom looks like. Then I chiseled off the spots where the epoxy had left icicles that would be visible on the final product, and I did yet another epoxy pour on the top surface. I felt like the final pour was a little bit uneven, And because I had done the final pour before I put the legs on, I scratched it again. The mark of a good woodworker is they don't make the same mistake 9 times. It's only 8. And I did the final pour before I put the legs on. So there were little scratches from the tools that I had been using. I had it upside down on my workbench. So I did one last pour to make sure everything was perfect and ready to sell to the final customer. On my current project, I tried to apply finish on the last step. Even the name finish should have been a clue to me when I should put it on the project at the end when it's finished. I guess I didn't catch that part? I don't know. I'm here now. I'm still woodworking. They let me do it. They let me keep going. I don't know who they are. I'm self-employed. I let me do it. Be sure to like and subscribe so that I can reach my goal of 100 subscribers before the end of the month, and would help me produce better content in the future. To see the projects I'm working on now, check out the videos on screen here.